Okay, hello everyone. Welcome. Thanks so much for joining us on this Friday afternoon. My name is Shahrazad Jafari, and I have the great pleasure of moderating our panel discussion today on Nature is a Common Language, the Natural Environment as a Resource for Peace Building, Reconciliation, and Well-Being. Hopefully, many of you have had a chance to participate in the Carter School's Peace Week events these last few days. There have been some absolutely fascinating discussions and presentations, and this event is actually the last in the series this week, so you are in for a treat. We're going to close out Peace Week with a bang. We were talking about this earlier, but if you want to bring out your drink of choice on this Friday afternoon, you are more than welcome to enjoy this conversation together. Our panelists are doing really interesting and important work and research in environment and well-being, environmental justice, environmental conflict, and peace building. So I expect we're going to have a really rich discussion together. We're going to be hearing from all of them first and then opening it up for Q&A and really hope to have a conversation with all of you. Before introducing each of them, I'd like to take just a few minutes to provide some context for our discussion today on where the idea for this panel came about, at least what informed my thinking on it. At the Carter School, I have the pleasure of serving as director of the school's Point of View International Retreat and Research Center, which is dedicated to peace building practice, teaching, and learning. Point of View is about 30 minutes from our main campuses and sits on 120 acres of pristine wooded land and wetlands with beautiful views of Belmont Bay. And in this tranquil and secluded environment, we host all sorts of different groups and communities, some of whom are experiencing conflict. Sometimes our work with them involves designing a process that helps them work through with each other some of the challenges they're facing, to dialogue and problem solve together. At other times, we might be providing workshops or trainings to help build skills toward effective communication and conflict transformation. And sometimes groups simply come to Point of View because they need a place for a retreat, a space for reflective or creative work or strategic thinking and planning together that, as we all know, is oftentimes difficult to do in a typical meeting or office or even conference environment. But what we've noticed that no matter what brings people to Point of View, we've observed time and again that oftentimes people will arrive, they're feeling stressed, they're feeling distracted, perhaps overwhelmed with the various challenges, whether in their personal lives or societal challenges that they're directly engaging in. But even after just a few hours of being in the natural environment of Point of View, there seems to be this transformation in which they start to feel calmer, more relaxed, perhaps more present, and thus seemingly more willing and more ready to engage with each other creatively and constructively on difficult issues. And what we've been observing is backed by a lot of data. There's a ton of really interesting research on how being in nature improves our physical and psychological well-being. It lowers our stress and even anger or depression. And so as a peace building center, we've been thinking a lot about how can we more actively, more intentionally engage the natural environment of which we are a part in our peace building and conflict resolution work. And here we've been inspired by an article by peace and conflict resolution scholar Stephanie Westland, in which she quoted a Mayan priest who said, in response to hearing an academic presentation on peace building, he said, "Your framework, your academic peace building framework, is missing the earth and skies, the winds and rocks. It does not say where you located. In a traditional Mayan view, if there is a problem in the community, the first thing we would ask is, did you greet the sun today? Did you thank the earth? Did you thank the corn? It's not the only thing, but it is the first. We must always know where, in what place and time we are located." And so Westland drew on this quote to then explore what might it mean for studies and practices in conflict resolution to recognize, to really include as an active participant in conflict resolution the earth and skies, the winds and rocks. Westland actually then went on to write a book on how veterans who suffer from PTSD are healing themselves through farming and outdoor activities. So at POV, as the place dedicated to peace building, to providing space and support for healing and reconciliation, and given what we've witnessed among the groups and communities who come and spend time in our space, we're really interested in this same question of how can we more actively think about and engage the land we're on, the air we're breathing, the incredible views of the water and landscape that we're taking in. How can we more actively draw on what we know are these positive physical and psychological, emotional impacts of nature in our efforts toward peace building and conflict transformation? At the same time, however, we need to acknowledge that for many people across time and space, being in nature, being amidst the trees and working with the land hasn't exactly felt peaceful. If the trees and landscape at POV could talk, at point of view could talk, what would they say about what they've seen over the last years and centuries of human experience on this land? The land we're on, that I'm actually on right now, as I'm at point of view, is Powhatan land, which was, of course, forcefully taken from the people indigenous to it, the Powhatan tribes, by the English in the 1600s. The land is also steeped in the history of slavery in this country. Point of view is just 10 minutes away from the home of George Mason, who was on the one hand the author of the Virginia Bill of Rights, and yet was also a very committed slaveholder. And many of you might know of the Enslaved Children of George Mason project, led by our colleagues in the History Department, as well as the Enslaved People of George Mason Memorial that is being built on campus to honor the more than 100 people enslaved by George Mason and his family. So this land on which point of view sits has witnessed a great deal of suffering and deep injustice, in which for some nature has been a place of violence and hard labor. And of course, that's not even to mention how we are destroying our land, of which oftentimes those who are impacted the most are people of color. And yet, point of view was gifted to the Carter School by Edwin and Helen Lynch, who, among many things, were strong social justice advocates and really believed in the work of the Carter School, that the Carter School was doing for peace and conflict resolution, and wanted their family home and their land to be a place for doing exactly this type of work. So how do we acknowledge this history of both great suffering and great hope on this land as we now today seek to serve as a place of healing and reconciliation? And we're actually having conversations with our colleagues in the History Department in Mason about some joint research on this, including some oral history projects with our students, both in the History Department and within the Peace and Conflict Resolution School. I'd also like to say something about the title of this event, which was inspired by a quote of President Jimmy Carter. President Carter said, "Like music and art, love of nature is a common language that can transcend political or social boundaries." As the newly named Jimmy and Rosalind Carter School for Peace and Conflict Resolution, it's particularly inspiring to think about the commitment of our namesakes to issues of environmental conservation and environmental justice, including before, during, and after his presidency. Growing up on a farm, working with around Black laborers, being friends with the children of the Black laborers who worked on his family farm. He later took strongly informed the strong anti-segregationist stance that he took in his life and during his presidency, advocating for switching to more renewable energy sources and pushing a number of environmental bills that protected natural lands and waterways and strengthened the Clean Water and Air Acts. And he also drew on the natural environment of Camp David as a place of refuge and a unique location for bringing world leaders together to seek to resolve intractable conflicts. And I should note that our vision at Point of View is to serve as a civilian Camp David, especially once we have cottages on site, to provide space and support to diverse groups and communities in resolving conflict. Most recently, Jimmy and Rosalind Carter built a solar farm on their land to meet more than half of the energy needs of their town. So they've certainly lived a life of strong commitment to environmental justice issues, which we can continue as the Carter School. So enough from me. I'd love to introduce our panelists and then really look forward to hearing from all of them. So we'll first hear from Dr. Suzanne Carmack. Dr. Carmack is an award-winning well-being promotion scholar and the author of 2 #1 bestsellers that bring the science of work-life well-being to the public: Well-Being Ultimatum and Genius Breaks. She's also the co-author of the forthcoming Weight Loss for Life. She is world-renowned for her well-being advocacy efforts to destigmatize the practices of mindfulness, compassion, and yoga in the workplace, while raising global awareness of sitting disease as a population health issue. She serves as a senior scholar for the Center for the Advancement of Well-Being and as an assistant professor in Mason's Department of Global and Community Health, where she teaches undergraduate and graduate courses in public health communication, leadership, advocacy, stakeholder engagement, and well-being. Next, we'll hear from Emily Sample, who is a PhD candidate at the Carter School, where she is also the executive director of the Raphael Lemkin Genocide Prevention Program. Previously, she has worked as Associate Director of Education at Holocaust Museum Houston and for the International Conference of the Great Lakes Region Ugandan National Committee on the Prevention and Punishment of Genocide and Mass Atrocities, as well as the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. She earned her BA from the College of William and Mary and her MA in Human Rights and Genocide Studies from Kingston University, London. Her research interests include sexual and gender-based violence, climate change, adaptation, and mass atrocities prevention. We'll then hear from Kevin Bryan, who has created Equinovel Partners LLC as a next step in a distinguished career as a nationally recognized leader in using collaboration to fashion equitable public policy in the environmental arena. Through Equinovel Partners, Kevin seeks to promote the deepening of equity and justice in the environmental community. This work includes advising national environmental organizations as they reorient their program frameworks to incorporate equity and justice as central pillars, building local and national efforts to address equity in transportation and mobility, and leading innovative collaborations to create programs that will expand opportunities in the environmental sector for people of color. And last but certainly not least, we'll hear from Dr. Sarah Cobb, who is the Juicy French Cumbie Chair at the Carter School, where she was also the director for 8 years. In her current role as faculty, she teaches and conducts research on the relationship between narrative and conflict. She is the director of the Center for the Study of Narrative and Conflict Resolution at the Carter School, which provides a hub for scholarship on narrative approaches to conflict analysis and resolution. She is the co-editor of the journal Narrative and Conflict, Explorations in Theory and Practice, and is widely published. Her books include Speaking of Violence, The Politics and Poetics of Narrative in Conflict Resolution, and the co-edited volume, Introduction to Conflict Resolution, Discourses and Dynamics. Dr. Cobb has been a leader in the fields of negotiation and conflict resolution studies, conducting narrative research on environmental conflicts, complex adaptive conflict systems, serious games or war games, and more recently, risk reduction within polarized as well as violent narrative landscapes. So before turning it over to our panelists, I just want to note that this session is being recorded, and you are welcome to submit questions using the Q&A function, which you should find on the bottom of your screen. You can submit questions at any time during the presentation, and then at the end, we'll open it up for Q&A. It's a good way to keep track of the questions as they come in, but you're also welcome to use the chat box as well. If you have a question, it's probably best to use the Q&A so we don't lose track of it. But if you'd rather say your question or comment, we'd love to hear from you. So just make a note of that when you submit your question, And I'll know to then unmute you when the time comes. All right, so let's, Susie, I'll turn it over to you. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And I want to thank everyone for the honor of being here. I truly appreciated the introduction and also this opportunity to be here with you. I'm excited to be with you all, and I'm also excited to hear from our fellow panelists. So I'm going to do my best to be careful of the real estate of my time and give you hopefully a short and sweet introduction to at least my perspective on this idea of language, nature, and our conversation about peace. So I do have a PowerPoint ready for you. And so as I pull that up, one moment, we're going to go right into that. Hopefully you can see. Okay, there we go. So if you could give me a thumbs up if you can see that. Okay, we can see that. All right. And I'm assuming everyone can hear me. It's always an interesting question. Can you hear me? Well, how would you say you can't? Okay, so, but moving forward, we're looking at promoting peace and well-being. As you'll see, I'm very grateful not only to be hosted by this incredible event and the Carter Center and Point of View, I'm also very grateful for the support of my colleagues, both at the Department of Global and Community Health, as well as the Center for the Advancement of Wellbeing at Mason. And I'm also a Mason alum, so I'm very much passionate about what we're doing across campuses, plural, about well-being, and to be able to share some perspective that I bring you. So I'm hoping that the video will work. I have a backup plan. We're actually going to do a little practice together to hopefully help show and not tell first about some of the work I do in the promotion of well-being and specifically with nature. So let's see if this cooperates with us with the technology, and we will breathe through it. If it doesn't, I will give you an alternate exercise with me. It'll just be a few minutes, but I invite you to join me if this hopefully cooperates. I thought it only appropriate that we start our day together with some ecotherapy. It's the science of being outside and how it's great for our health. So I encourage you to take a walk with me, to focus in on the sounds that you hear behind my voice. You might hear the rustling of my feet on the ground, the crow that is saying hello, a few other critters in the background. I'm not sure what that sound is. Let's just pause here for a moment, taking time to be mindful together. Now let's listen to the sound of your breath, thinking about how your exhales can help you to release any tension that might be there. Breathing into your heart space. How can you embrace the wonder that's within you? Much like the wonder of these trees that are next to me, each leaf telling a unique story of its own. What stories happen in your mind as you take on this journey? How do you embrace the power of your breath? Or the power of change, like this little leaf right here? Nature has a powerful story to tell all of us. We can take a moment to listen by going outside and enjoying her beauty,
or closing our eyes and finding it within.
So hopefully that gives you a bit of a sense of the idea of practicing mindfulness in nature. We could not go on a walking meeting together for logistic reasons. Also, full disclosure, that was not the beautiful point of view that we have here at Mason that as part of our host for today. But it was my humble and very low tech, right out of my iPhone attempt to show you the importance of doing sometimes the next best thing to being out in nature is to be able to use digital tools to help us to experience it. And so this is one specific area of public health I'm especially interested in, and is something for us to explore, especially in the challenges of our world today, in the inability, the health inequities we have, where some folks do not have access to a space like I just showed you nearby or in walking distance, or even they are limited for health reasons from going outside. So it's an interesting time to be promoting public health and nature, which is a small part of my applied research agenda. So I've called the agenda item today's fun in 15, in other words, 15 minutes, maybe even less. But this idea of explaining a little bit more about what just happened in my low tech but well-intentioned video. We're going to talk very briefly about something called eco or ecotherapy, which is an interesting space for public health promotion because it is both a part of public health and even healthcare today. And it's part of a campaign that I've been honored to work on called ParkRX. You've seen that on a few slides. I'll go ahead and share a little more about it and my own small involvement with it. But it's a powerful campaign that continues today that I hope the messages of that public health campaign can resonate even beyond the campaign itself. I'd also like to share a little bit about a more broader context of some of the work I'm doing in the land of promoting peace, which I feel like is relevant, and you'll see the crossovers with nature as a common language there. And then, hopefully give you some takeaways. When I'm honored to do a chat or like this, I like to make it as relevant as I can without having met you before I prepared the slides. So I hope that some of the suggestions I give you at the end will, on one end of the spectrum, be affirming to some practices that you may already be engaged in for yourself, a quiet nudge to re-engage with those practices as we all try to center ourselves in the storm of our lives today, or perhaps try some practices that perhaps you're not trying yet. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and jump in. So I call this slide the what just happened slide. And I'm more than happy to share the particular slide deck with you. There is a powerful story on that was actually put on NBC News a few years back that's linked on this slide deck. I'm more than happy to share them with you. So if you were to search NBC News and ParkRX, you'd find it. I don't mean to give a specific promotion to any news agency. They just happen to have done the piece. There's also some really powerful work if you, again, do a search for ParkRX. There are many different organizations involved with this campaign. To essentially give you the elevator version, it's a campaign that recruits and promotes the concept of going outside as a prescription. And this idea of shifting the idea that medicine is only through pharmacological or surgical solutions, but that lifestyle generally, going outside specifically, can be a prescription for our health, hence the name ParkRX. When I was involved with this campaign, and as you may have seen by my work here at Mason, prior to coming to Mason, I did a lot of community and globally based public health promotion work. And now I'm honored to train the promotion strategists of tomorrow through our department and center. But if nothing else, I want to convey to you the power of this campaign was something that started in part because of bringing like-minded folks together that were really had a passion for bringing the promotion of the outdoors and the lands, and ecotherapy, the idea that we are engaging in therapeutic practices outside for our mental and physical health. A lot of different stakeholder groups coming together and really having kind of a more the greater than the sum of its parts kind of approach to promoting this concept. I was asked to get involved in around 2016, well after Dr. Czar, whose name you see on the slide. He is a DC-based physician that started well over a decade ago, looking at the idea that he could be promoting the outdoors to his own patients, and slowly did much advocacy locally and nationally. And now there's an entire ParkRX campaign. There's a actual nonprofit. There's even connection for doctors now to be able to refer their patients to locally based parks that their patients have access to. So there's work being done, and it continues to try to create an infrastructure so that it drills down to the user experience, the patient experience, and the patient-provider interaction, where the patient is asked how active they're being, whether or not they're being able to be outside, and the patient shares maybe their preferred activities or something they'd like to try. And the physician can actually use these database tools to refer the patient to not just any park, but a park or other outside means that they could engage in the endeavors that they're interested in and or would be doctor recommended. And we know that lifestyle medicine, which is, for those who are new to it, it's more than wellness. Well, no, let me be careful. It is wellness. It perhaps is a rebranding of wellness, but it's really a recognition by both the provider as well as even the public health community that our lifestyle choices matter. And in an era when much of the developed world is actually having challenges with mortality rates in the developed world because of chronic disease, which is caused in large part by, guess what, stress and chronic disease and lifestyle behaviors that are not good for us. It's that much more important that those of us in public health get not only creative but strategic about the messaging that we're giving to the public about how they can live as well as possible, depending on what tools and access they have. So it's a great case study in bringing different stakeholder groups together. When I got involved in 2016, it was part of the celebration of the National Park Service's centennial. They were working together with the Institute of Golden Gate and multiple other stakeholders. And for anyone listening from that group, I apologize for not giving the whole list, but a team of graduates and undergraduate students and I were asked to help out to create a social media campaign to try to get the word out, not only to providers, but to patients, and to really shift the idea that going outside may not necessarily make a difference to one's health, when actually the research more and more shows us that it really does. And so I encourage you to check it out. I'll share these links with you if you like, but for time, I'll give you kind of the highlights of what it tells us. So going outside is not exactly the same as ecotherapy, although honestly, that's really the thrust or the gist of it. What I can say is that it's oftentimes when we really get into the specific definitions in the literature, it's depending on who we read, it really is about bringing therapeutic practices outdoors and again, connecting them to nature in some way. So for example, physical activity we know is great for so many different dimensions of our well-being and our health. It protects our longevity and our quality of life. And so physical activity of any kind, assuming it is not problematic for your medical condition, right? And you don't have a contraindication otherwise, physical activity anywhere, inside or outside, can really be beneficial. However, when we couple that physical activity to going out in nature, then we're really giving it a double boost, if you will, because the act of being outside, we know, does increase, much of the literature is telling us that it does increase the power of what that physical activity can give us. And we could go through all of the different lifestyle medicine choices, and I'll show you a slide in a few minutes that gives you an idea of what I mean by lifestyle medicine choices. It's a different way to frame, and if you'll forgive me, I like boiling things down. Those things that mom and dad and aunts and uncles told us we should be doing to take care of ourselves. Some of the story is no different. We just have more science to explain why they're good. But in any case, some of the things you see on the slide, being outside, whether it's simply enjoying nature and admiring the leaves, as we did in our practice to start, being mindful of where we are and what the stories are that we're hearing from nature and within our own breath, or simply coming into these practices can really help us, and it can be a really big part of our health and well-being. It does get interesting to think about how access can be compromised to these practices, whether someone is living in a neighborhood that does not allow for that kind of proximity, or we perhaps, again, all of us are challenged in our lifestyles today due to many things that are happening in our world. So I want to be sensitive that one of the challenges of public health is that, on the one hand, it's exciting to share with you today all these benefits of ecotherapy, but I do so with almost a somber heart, because I know that not everyone has access to these pieces. And part of the challenges of health inequity and addressing it from a social determinants of health perspective is to recognize that not everyone has access. It's not just about the person's individual behavior change. It's also about creating an environment around them to be able to allow them to access it. So the next couple slides, I won't keep up long, but this is a slide that if I'm asked to introduce my work to folks, I try to drill it down, and there's a lot of copy here, so I'll just give you the highlight that what I'm very interested in, that kind of takes us a little further altitude out from this specific niche of looking at promotion of ecotherapy and physical activity, specifically outdoors, is really solving three public health problems that are really threatening our longevity and our quality of life in our modern world. And this was before COVID, and even more so a challenge with all the factors we're looking at from an occupational health lens. So stress contagion is a very specific phenomena, and I think it's interesting to look at that through the lens of connection that the Carter Center is advocating for us all to be engaged with in conflict resolution and peace building study and practice. And the idea of being able to do that at a place like Point of View is almost an intervention. It is an intervention, or series of them in their own right. But some of the newer research is showing us that stress is not just about personal resilience, coping, natural ability, and so on. It is also something that we do catch from each other, both stress and or well-being. And so a lot of what I do in the applied work is actually looking at how teams and organizations can be building cultures that create and foster and promote well-being, person to person, and within norms, cultural norms that we reestablish, as well as how that affects the individual. So as the Dalai Lama has said, if you want to be happy, practice compassion. If you want to have others be happy, practice compassion. The other harder to talk about areas that I also look at, which it's interesting to think of how a walk outdoors, as simple as what we saw today, could be something that connects to this, but is difficult, and again, as somber as it is to talk about, is suicide prevention. We have an incredible challenge with suicide as a prevalence issue across all age groups, and it's especially disturbing that youth have a very high prevalence rate today, again, even before COVID. So some other researchers and I are actually working on a large-scale study to be able to learn more about how we can detect trends with regards to well-being and isolation, and be able to create interventions that bring different tools of well-being, to include nature, or the second best of digital versions of nature, like you saw, to youth, to be able to help them to practice micro break taking as we go forward into more specifics in the proposal and the work that we're doing. And then finally, where I got into public health as a yoga teacher and yoga trainer, which is where I was for 2 decades before becoming a researcher and professor, is the space of fighting the fight of sitting disease. And a lot of the work I've done in the promotion of well-being, to include with the World Health Organization, has been in raising awareness of the importance that we move throughout the day. So as I finish up my chat in a minute or two, I encourage you to take a stretch break on your own. So one way to boil down the work that I am, as I pivot into how this really matters to you and what could be a takeaway for you, are the next several slides. And this first one is the theoretic model that came out of my dissertation. Essentially, it was a research study on well-being and how communication and well-being intersect. And what I really landed on is, the dissertation on a slide here, which is that there's a lot of difficulty in the promotion of well-being, because so many people have a different idea of what well-being is. If we could get real, when you saw the video earlier, maybe some of you were excited to see the image. Maybe some of you had a problem with, why are we starting with this? Maybe it was uncomfortable to hear the noise in the background. Maybe you're having your own challenges with staying digitally focused and not distracted for anything today, because we're asked to do so much. This is all well and good, and actually to be expected. But this idea that each person has a different idea of what well-being is. And so when we put that in a well-being promotion lens, which is really the thrust of what I do, and honored to collaborate with others to do, is that we've got to think first about what the other party, person, group, public health agency, what do they think what do they think well-being is? And then we engineer the promotion and the intervention to that, because ultimately it doesn't matter what we think, it matters what they think. And so that's where I come into my quick tips for you in terms of practicing peace within, and this idea of connecting to not just external nature, but the nature within you. The first well-being tip I would share is this idea of practicing peace within by being kind and, yes, self-compassionate to yourself in your self-talk. The nature that we have of the language in our body, a relevant topic for our work today, is that as we are talking to ourselves, if we are in a space of harsh self-criticism and not being peaceful in the dialogue we have within, it does kick in our fight, freeze, flee, or fawn response, and not our nature and nurture response. So be nice to yourself. The next quick slide has a lot to look at, and I won't go through the details for our time together, but it's a slide, that shows you essentially a big picture of that lifestyle medicine stuff I was talking about before. It does matter that we eat healthy and hopefully mostly a plant-based diet. So there's a connection to nature there. Getting the natural amount of sleep that our bodies need, and being careful about that even as we age and that gets more difficult. Taking time to move as we were designed in our bodies naturally to do, and taking time to connect with each other. These simple strategies can help us to manage stress. And since 80 to 90% of healthcare visits are based on a stress problem, chronic disease especially, it's that much more important that we do what Mom said, as I was saying before. The last couple tips, and for time I'll be even shorter and sweeter hopefully, is to connect with nature. And I'm a pragmatist. I grew up in a small town near Pittsburgh, and so yes, please go outside, but if not, connect as best you can with nature as we did today. And also, let's not be afraid to have walking meetings when social restrictions permit that, and we can do that safely. Years ago, I helped the World Health Organization do a whole campaign on walking meetings We know that moving out, and specifically moving in any place actually, improves problem solving and creativity by up to 60%. So taking time to move first and connect with your team while you move is going to help the team to be able to be that much more productive. And the final two, I think, go exactly with our introduction for today. The idea of connecting with others, going to a place with like point of view and connecting, or doing that digitally. Keep in mind, these icons were made before mask icons were created, but it's important that we connect. Social support predicts well-being. This is part of my own research results, as well as many, many other scholars. And so it's important that we try to our best to stay connected. And I think all of us are doing that in our own way, but let's not give up on doing that in more creative ways as time goes on. And as was actually mentioned in the introduction, taking time to salute the sun and greeting the day with gratitude may sound like a meme off your social media page, but the science does tell us that gratitude practices every day, and being grateful for what Mother Nature gives us really does make a difference in our neurobiology and in the ways that we see the world. So thank you so much for allowing me to take the time to share this well-being perspective with you. I'm always intrigued by possibilities of partnering with others who are trying to bring more peace and well-being to the world. So thanks again for inviting me, and I look forward to answering questions when we get to that. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. I'm one moment as I try to switch the screen. Okay. Thank you, Dr. Carmark. That was really interesting. I know this is just a sliver of the work that you've been doing, and we can dive into more later. I see there's already a question for you, but really interesting to think about the work that you're doing, the research behind it, especially in this moment in which we are so reliant on digital tools, and so many people are experiencing such heightened levels of stress and uncertainty. So I really appreciate especially the practical tips that you shared. All right, Emily, we'll turn it to you. I'm going to put you on the screen, and I think you have a slideshow as well. Is that correct?
I do. Thank you so much. All right. So thank you so much. And thank you, Dr. Carmack, for that interesting talk to begin with. I'm really interested in the intersection of nature and peace building, but not just nature in and of itself, but rather looking at some of the intersections between peace building as an option, and having the environment play an active role in being either a connector or what someone would call something like a spoiler in the role of peace building. So I want to start off just looking at some of the headlines over the last years. It's well known at this point that we are going to be having conflict over resources, right? This is not new. This is something that we have kind of come to terms with already, but we have not yet figured out where we as peace builders stand in that role. And as environmentalists, as kind of writ large, where we connect with our role as defenders of natural resources, defenders of peace. And so what I want to start with today is kind of this intersection of peace and the environment. What you see here is an annual rankings list from Benjamin Valentine. And what I want to draw your attention to is the intersection of the Environmental Performance Index and the Positive Peace Index. And here he looks at the top 30 countries on each list, that are the top 30 countries at risk. And what you see here on the far I think right side of your screen, are these two lists of 30 countries that are the EPI is the Environmental Performance Index, and the PPI is the Positive Peace Index. And what you see is that there is almost a one-to-one overlap, almost. And that is what he's showing here with the 0.87. So what is it about countries that are performing poorly on the Peace Index and also performing poorly on the Environmental Performance Index? What is the conversation that's happening between them? And so I want to look at this within the context of the United States. So this is obviously a global issue, but as a US scholar, I'm also very cognizant of the fact that we're often outward looking, and I'd like to take this opportunity to look inward as well, because we definitely don't have this figured out ourselves either. So I have recently edited a volume called Building Peace in America, and my chapter is on environmental justice and the idea of peace building within our current the Anthropocene, the current setting that we are in of global human-induced climate change. So to start, if you're unfamiliar with the term Anthropocene, it's what the age that we're currently in. We have moved out of the Holocene and we have moved into what environmental scholars focus on as an era that is dominated by human change. There's still much debate within the community when the Anthropocene began, whether it was at the beginning of the Industrial Age or more recently. But the important part of this is that right now we are facing unprecedented times, right? We are trying to look at peace building within the context of lessons learned. And unfortunately, our lessons learned are not going to be as effective in this new world, right? Our conflict resolution and peace building policies are currently built on the assumption that conflicts take place in stable, predictable environments. But what happens when the land, the air, and the water become part of the conflict? So I'll start this conversation with an examination of environmental racism, right? It is not necessarily the concept that we cannot have peace in conjunction with a safe environment, but rather that we can't build peace until our environment is safe. So here, and again, I'm looking inward as towards the United States. We are huge consumers of electricity, waste, and water, as well as trash removal services and things like chemical facilities. But no one wants to live next to any of these facilities. They are more often built in or near poor or minority communities, often communities of color, and mostly communities who lack political, social, and financial capital to advocate for themselves. Many of these communities were established well before these facilities. Environmental justice has grown out of these communities and is built and led by people of color. So one would think that the environmental justice movement and the environmental movement would be in lockstep with one another, but that is simply not the case. Many of the original environmentalists that we think of, Aldo Leopold, Gifford Pinchot, are part of the continued issues of white supremacy within the environmentalist structure. As long ago as 1990, the environmental justice activists have wrote a series of letters to the Group of 10, the 10 major environmental organizations of the US, which was the Audubon Society, Environmental Defense Fund, Friends of the Earth, many of the organizations that still exist today. And these letters called attention to the whiteness of the organizations, their staff and their donors, as well as their own culpability and patterns of environmental racism. And so these issues are well known within the community. It's been over 30 or almost 30 years now. And yet we're still seeing these large corporations or these large organizations struggling with whiteness within their own communities and their own donor and their own boards. So the environmental justice movement is somewhat to the side of the environmental movement, right? They are step siblings, right? They're very close to one another, but they're not necessarily aligned because of these issues. And I would say that the environmental justice movement was born out of these fence line communities. And fence line communities had their beginnings in North Carolina, in Warren County, where they really focused at the grassroots level of building peace in their communities through the concept of environmental justice. So fence line communities are communities that border or share a fence with industrial plants, factories, waste dumps, oil pipelines, treatment plants, mines, mining operations, power plants, and other man-made sites that leach toxins. So this is kind of a huge list. And you might not realize simply how many of these sites exist in the United States. We don't realize how many spaces of not just waste removal, but industrial creation are really in and among all of our neighborhoods. So we are focusing on this because of the way that environmental degradation of water, land, and air impacts the health and well-being of all living things. Now, it does not impact everyone equally. So an interesting intersection for this that I have spent quite a bit of my time researching is the intersection with gender. Environmental degradation uniquely impacts people who are, have been, or wish to be pregnant. This is not due to women's inherent connection to fertility, motherhood, or nature, but rather to the chemical reactions of how toxins affect reproductive organs. Recent studies have focused hugely on how breast cancer rates, for example, among women exposed to toxins in their homes and in their workplaces. So this is a specific space in which people who can or have become pregnant may be unable to live in peace in their own communities because of this environmental degradation. This is, of course, most well known in issues of Flint, Michigan. Within a year of the local government switching their water supply, there was the general fertility rate in women in Flint decreased by 12%, and fetal death rates increased by 58%. So we're seeing a huge change in the way that women are able to interact in their homes and in their communities because of these environmental toxins. You can also see, I have on the slide, Little Miss Flint and some of the water protectors from the Standing Rock Sioux tribe, who were among the front line against the Dakota Access Pipeline. So within environmental justice, there is a secondary subset, which is specifically focused on the environmental degradation caused by climate change. So climate justice focuses very specifically on the uneven distribution of environmental risks, specifically due to the effects of climate change. So the majority of climate change causing greenhouse gas emissions have been released by the so-called Western nations and some of the up-and-coming BRIC countries. But the adverse effects of climate change are not limited to these polluting nations. The countries experiencing the highest rates of poverty, inequality, and unstable governance are often the highest risk of the effects of climate change and have the lowest capacity to mitigate these effects. So These countries are also often the lowest emitters of greenhouse gases. Climate justice recognizes that there are economic, infrastructure, political, and social inequalities that are and will be exacerbated by the effects of climate change. So while climate justice is often looking exteriorly at how the United States is affecting the rest of the world and how our choices about our policies are adversely affecting other countries, there's also instances of climate injustice internally in our own populations. So the photo you see here is the Isle de Jean Charles, and it is home to the Biloxi Chitimacha Choctaw tribe. And as you can see, this one little road that is like directly in the middle of the screen is basically the entire island at this point. The encroaching water has consumed 98% of the island's landmass, reducing it to a 320-acre strip, which has resulted in the loss of the tribe's identity, culture, and economic resources. This tribe was resettled here in 1876, but oral tradition has this group occupying this island as early as the early 1800s. And in 2015, this tribe received a grant from the Housing and Urban Development of the US government, Housing and Urban Development Department of the US government, to resettle the whole tribe. But it has not gone smoothly, right? So the tribe is facing increasing pressures from storms and relative sea level rise. But the tribe feels that they haven't been able to hold a powwow since before Hurricane Katrina over 10 years ago. So even with this grant that they've received, they haven't been able to crystallize their tribe into one space. And right now, despite this $48 million grant, they are working on issues of assimilation and moving other quote unquote climate refugees into the same resettlement area. So this is a question of sovereignty for the tribe as well as cultural identity. So this is a very highly watched area by both climate scholars as well as genocide and sovereignty scholars who are interested to see how this community is going to be able to hold on to its identity, hold on to its culture, and hold on to its financial well-being while potentially uprooting the entire tribe to settle in a new space in Louisiana. So this is potentially the future of climate justice if we don't address the changes on the ground. A World Bank report last year that came out said by 2050, as many as 143 million people will be displaced in Latin America, Asia, and Africa due to the effects of climate change. So if this one tribe required a $48 million grant from HUD and has not been able to successfully resettle in over 5 years now, what is the future of climate change refugees as they're looking for mass migration? So in conclusion, the idea that our environment is settled, that our peace-building methods can, as we talked about in the introduction, kind of ignore the environment in which peace is being settled, is kind of an idea of the past, right? Looking forward, we are going to have to incorporate the environment not just into the idea of how healthy it is to be outside, but also if the outside is still healthy. Peace cannot be built in communities that live in unhealthy, unsafe conditions, or in constant anxiety about the potential for poisonous industrial accidents. So going from the large scale to the micro level, communities internally cannot build peace if they are constantly worried about their children having asthma or lead-related rashes or an industrial accident where a mine blows up next to them, right? Environmental conditions must be integrated into a dual-pronged approach, both recognizing it as part of past injustices and as a potential future trigger for issues in the community, regional, and national level. I look forward to hearing any questions that the group has. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emily. Let's see. I think if you don't mind stopping your screen share, there we go.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much. That was really interesting. I was struck by what you said, that the lessons learned in our field have been based on this assumption of stable environments. And I think you so clearly showed through the range of examples just how tragic the implications of that are, and just the urgency of these issues that we're facing and the questions that we have to grapple with as a field. So thank you so much. All right, we will next hear from Kevin. Whenever you're ready, I'm happy to see that glass in your hand. You're on.
I decided to take you up on your offer.
Good.
To enjoy a glass of vino this afternoon. So listen, thank you very much to Shahrazad, to George Mason, Escar, to the Carter Center for giving me this opportunity to speak with you today. I'm not going to talk very long. I just want to highlight a few things that are part of the work that I do and the thinking that I have been doing over the course of the past several years around these issues of nature, access to nature, access to public lands and to open spaces. Who has that access? Who is controlling the decision-making on that access? And just and give you a few things to think about. And actually the first thing the first thought that I'd like to put out today is, I want to challenge the notion that nature is a common language. I want to encourage discussion today about the fact that about what that language is for different groups. We talk about nature in different groups in this country in different ways. How do we create a common language that talks about the importance of nature to our well-being, as Dr. Carmack talked about a little bit earlier in terms of physical and mental wellness? As we talked about, as Emily just talked about with some of the environmental justice concerns, it's so ironic to me to hear you talk about Warren County. I think I was about 11 years old, living in North Carolina and hearing those stories on the news every day for about a year, as they talked about dumping the PCBs along highways in that part of the state. And I have been, and I've driven through North Carolina, through that part of North Carolina, which is kind of the northwestern corner, with my parents every once in a while as we were traveling to see relatives or going for visits into Virginia. And so it's ironic that you talk about that. That was my first real encounter with environmental justice. And it certainly isn't where the environmental justice movement was born. Language is created in part through experience. It's not just linguistics or speech patterns. It's about how I experience something. That's how we get slang. That's how we get different words meaning different things over the course of generations. How I experience a thing, a concept, a feeling, influence how I speak about it. So does our society truly allow or even encourage us to experience nature in similar ways across our multiple cultures and perspectives? You know, I mean, how many times have you heard Black people don't camp? Black people don't ski. Black people are afraid of the water. They don't swim. Is it possible that people of color, marginalized communities, have not always had access to swimming pools or to beaches, to campsites, to the outdoors in general, where are the parks? Trust for Public Land, a number of other organizations have been diving into this access to public land and to parks. I think one of those organizations has a 10-minute to a park program where they believe that every person in America should have access to a park within a 10-minute walk of where they live. You know, these kinds of questions about access are critically important. I also want to ask, is it possible that part of the experience of nature has been wholly unnatural? I mean, if part of the experience with outdoors for a whole group of people has been about the trauma of lynchings, fleeing oppression, a general fear of being caught by police, by just a group of angry people who are in a predominant position in the society. Trust me, I'm not gonna want to go out there either. And certainly my parents, grandparents had some of those experiences. So I wasn't encouraged to go camping. You know, my parents weren't taking me camping. They weren't taking me to beaches. They weren't, you know, encouraging me to indulge and engage in national parks, state parks. So this has to be, we have to understand that this is part of the experience. And so when we talk about nature as a common language, we actually have to embrace that ideal and recognize that we have not created that as a society. Just think back to the lynchings and the hangings this past summer. We had 5 African Americans lynched or hung this past summer following protests of racial injustice after the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery. When you sit back and think about that, think about how those people were found out in nature, you start to recognize that this is a serious, we have to think about this. We have to put these ideas and concepts and understand that this is part of the dialogue, this is part of the experience. You know, 100 years ago, less than 100 years ago, lynchings were widespread. They ended up being public events in many parts of the South. You know, it was celebrated as part of nature, being outside. So we have to recognize that this is part of the experience. And so how do we how do we have that honest conversation about how different groups of people experience the outdoors? How is that changing? There are whole groups of folks out there that are, people of color are experiencing nature in a different way. There's brown girls surf, brown girls camp. There are, you know, I can go out, I live about a 10-minute walk from Rock Creek Park. I've got my own national park that's part of my backyard. That's how fortunate I am as a human being. And I get a chance to go out and see crews of people and, you know, create their own Peloton and they're bike riding through this unbelievably scenic part of America that we call Rock Creek Park, that I call my backyard. And there are people of color that are there. You can go through that park and you can see people experiencing the park in different ways. There are groups hiking, like doing some things that we might traditionally think as part of being in nature and being in parks. There are also folks out there grilling, having a barbecue, kids playing double dutch in the park, you know, doing things in different ways. Can the way that I experience nature, which might include family barbecues, the kids playing ball in the park, is that celebrated in the same way that bird watching, hiking, camping are celebrated as part of the nature experience? So we're hoping that we can use this opportunity to have a discussion about what is the language? How do we bring these notions of nature and enjoying nature, communing in nature together, and actually start to experience some different pieces of it? It'd be great to see more groups experiencing the family bonding period in nature. It'd be be great to get out and do some hiking and experience what that means. Rock climbing. What are we open to that? Are we open to allowing people to experience nature in different ways, and then sometimes the same way, without making an assumption about who they are and whether or not they should be doing I think it's really important for us to start looking at policies. I think one of the things that struck me, and I posted this to my LinkedIn account a few weeks ago, was that very recently there was passage of the Land and Water Conservation Act, which is incredibly important to providing an annual appropriation for creating parks and public lands in cities and suburbs and rural areas around the country. Last year, there was permanent reauthorization of that fund, which means that the fund is there, but there was no money appropriated to it. And the problem in the past had been that there were different levels of funding in a given year, depending upon what Congress decided to do with it. So that fund could be there could be money not appropriated for the fund because somebody makes the determination that funds are needed to put elsewhere. But that doesn't decrease the need. This past summer, not only did we already have the permanent reauthorization of the fund, but we had the permanent funding of it at $900 million a year. That's a huge win. That's something that a number of us have been fighting for the past 2 or 3 years, and it was great to see that happen. And at the same time, there was $9 billion allocated for funding some of the maintenance and operational upgrades in a number of our national parks. Both of these were huge victories, and so these will actually enable more people to have access to parks, to make certain, and particularly the Land and Water Conservation Fund will actually allow us to create parks in areas of the country, in neighborhoods that don't already have those. So these are huge, and to be able to do that in perpetuity is an incredible achievement and accomplishment. We need to do more. There needs to be private investment put in some places to make certain that we're looking at parks and public lands. Here in Washington, D.C., we're blessed with a really strange street grid. And we've got the block grid, and then we got the diagonals that run across it, and streets stop in certain places because a monument is here and it picks up on the other side. And it creates these little pockets of land. And if we actually developed those and create those, we could develop in a number of ways. We could put buildings there. But are we really going to need more office buildings going forward? Are we going to actually create opportunities for public land, public space to occupy some of these open lots? We could really use some of the dollars from the Land and Water Conservation Fund, as well as private dollars, to help develop those lands and create real places for people to come together. Let's create some opportunities to bring folks together around and create those societal bonds that seem to be so frayed right now. We have that chance, we have that opportunity to do that. I hope that we can push for these kinds of policies going forward. Can we talk a bit more about the social determinants of health and how important mental health and physical well-being are, and the fact that nature can really provide a huge lift to us in trying to address those, particularly in communities of color, where those social determinants create so much stress, which then turns around and creates the chronic health issues that Suzanne talked about a little bit earlier this evening. So I'm hopeful that what we can do is have a discussion today about what public lands mean. How do we create a common language that really is focused on allowing people to experience the outdoors, to experience nature in different ways, and being able to talk about that with one another, and being able to understand how it's relevant in whatever way we engage. And then how that language turns into policy that allows us to create more open space, more green space that allows us to then continue to spread these benefits and create greater access to these benefits and opportunities that come from our public lands.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Kevin. I really appreciate the questions you're raising, and sincerely hope that we can have this conversation that you're asking us to have in the last part of our discussion. And when I approached you to be on this panel, you asked that question right away. You said, can we talk about it? Is there a common language of nature? And I was like, yeah, that is the first question we should be asking ourselves. So I really appreciate you raising that.
Cheers.
Cheers. Okay, well, certainly not least, but last on our list of speakers, Sarah Cobb, I'll turn it over to you.
Well, thank you very much. And I'm eager to quit talking even before I start, just to pick up a lot of the threads that you three before me have laid down. And there's just so much to say here. So I'm going to whiz through some thoughts that I had and prepared for this. And then, trying to get more airtime for conversation, a little less of me and a little more of everybody. That's what I'm going to try to do. So I'm going to share my screen here. And let's go here. It's out of the way. And go here. Look at that wave. This is about politicizing nature. And I'm really moving in the same direction of several of you. And I think a lot of these thoughts are connected. I wanted to challenge this sort of language that we've got about what does it mean to be in nature. And you look at these folks like Thoreau, we come out taller than the trees, we grow if we're in nature, we leave aside the beaten path, we go off on our own. This sounds like being free, in nature. We've got, Sylvia Plath talking about it's wonderful, we can be happy. We've got this place we are that nature is over and over talked about as a place of imagination and relaxation. We've got this discourse in place, right? This is Richard Feynman. So you've got Claude Monet, my wish is to stay always like this, living quietly, So nature ends up being in these, if you look at our discourse about this, it's a retreat, it's a separation, it's a place apart, right? Where we have strength and we get happy and we, renew ourselves and we, take advantage of the fruit of nature. It's where our spirit comes out. We get closer to knowledge if we're there. So I wanted to contest this discourse. It sort of naturalizes this discourse, presumes that there's sort of this, as I said, nature's a place for healing and finding happiness, that it's stable and enduring in its presence. And yet we've got Emily and others arguing that it's clearly not. It's about stepping outside of everyday pathways and returning to somehow a natural state, as though in the pathways we're not, in our normal everyday life, we're not in the natural state. It over and over again, we refer to nature as a resource to be used, to be commodified, to be, access, to be, and while I would be in favor of everybody being able to get outdoors and take a hike or grill or do whatever else they want to do, the notion of it as something we would use is, I think, at the core, maybe a problem, or we have to add that to the list of problems, perhaps. So it's as though the material world this natural world is beyond human civilization or society, and it's in its undomesticated condition, right? And yet we know that all the world's lands, my slides are possessed here. All the lands, at least the United States, were occupied by other people. And Emily has mentioned this explicitly. So we don't have any of this sort of land that wasn't already domesticated. There's not like a place that's outside of civilization. These places were all civilized all over the world. And this is just a quick map to show you the nature of the tribes that were all over the United States and into the north. And where Scheherazade is right now, and she's mentioned this, the Powhatan native people, it was the site of the Doog settlement, which is, when explorers came up, the English explorers, white explorers came up in 1608, they discovered it, right? And this is the distribution of the, this is Belmont Bay, right? That's what this is, right out there in Northern Virginia. And it says Indian land on the map, right? And this is the dimensions of the Algonquin language where it was spoken. They call it pre-contact. You know, what a creepy phrase, right? Pre-contact, as though, I mean, you see embedded in this is the idea that contact with white folks was, you know, deadly, basically, to these folks who were wiped out and removed and made sick and etc. So nature is this really place. I'm trying to politicize it by arguing it's not pristine, it's not separate, it's not away, it's got its own history, it's got these laid down forgotten storylines. And Kevin was talking about, you know, nature is a place where people get lynched. You know, that's nature. Those stories are there. So and somehow we wipe that away. We end up you know, sort of civilizing nature by by removing all this complexity from the land itself and who was there. The people that were there in the Belmont Bay, you know, they fought war after war after war. There were 3 big battles fought, and then they were put on reservations, and then they became extinct, these people. And I've got here a little clip of the Articles of Peace between the most serene and mighty prince, Charles II, and by the grace of God, King of England and Scotland, etc., and the Indian kings and several Indian kings and queens. Of course, that, you know, these treaties didn't hold, and we know what happened here. And this is what we have today in Belmont Bay. This is a current, you know, picture of one of the pictures of Belmont Bay, and we see extinction and removal and erasure, and so that I'm trying to sort of denaturalize nature a little bit, as though it's not this easy story today. And here's basically, you know, here's what we have today in terms of Native people's lands in the United States. That's where they are. And they had been prior to that. I showed you that earlier map, all over this place. So we've got a big story to tell here about land, about the environment, about nature. So first, I think we've got to figure out places, and Kevin was talking about places where people can gather. And I would even go a little bit further and say, gather and talk about the place itself, where we could acknowledge repression and violence. We got to be able to talk about these things. And that's basically what the public sphere is. And we don't need to do that inside of buildings. We can do that in natural environments, very much like the Museum of Peace and Justice in, you know, Montgomery. It's fun. I don't know if anybody's been down there, but I have, and it's fabulous. It's because it's outdoors on top of this hill, and you go down underground. It's completely penetrated by the environment it's part of, and it's a beautiful place to begin to think about repression and the history of repression and violence. We could generate some stories, rituals, where stories of pain and suffering could be held and circulated. One of my colleagues, Colleen Carmuth, Colette Carmuth, who's one of our alum, and she used to work, I think she still does, for the U.S. Park Service. And she's in charge, get this, of trying to figure out how to get the American public together on some of these sites where there's been the kind of violence that Kevin and Emily have been referring to, which, you know, where sites of racism, sites of bombing, sites of lynching. How do you make those histories of that, you know, so the parks are not this place to go away and not think about those things. The parks are these places where you come together with other people and talk about them. And ultimately, I think we got to be thinking about how to do reparations, not only for the loss of the land and the space and the way of life and the culture, as Emily mentioned, but for the damage it's done to so many generations, for the trauma it's done. So I'm working right now in the Arctic, and you know, these are people, the native people that there, for instance, in Utiavik, are suffering from melting perma-ice, etc., and permafrost. It's destroying the buildings. They're having storm surges. Their livelihoods and sustainability are at risk. They're losing their language. They have what they call lateral violence, but, you know, generated and, let's say, exacerbated by all these changes in the climate. So, you know, I guess I wanted to learn. I've been talking to these Inupiat people who are living there, and they've been describing to me, nature is not something you consume. It's not a resource that you get. You don't even own it, you know, but a context for living and working together with others, right? And people don't go into nature, right? They leave their world and go into nature. For these folks, they live in the natural world. And they're drawing on folk wisdom and being part of natural cycles and integrating into them, right? They're interested in anchoring their traditional knowledge inside of scientific communities, for instance, where they want it to be respected and held up as important as other kinds of more scientific traditional knowledge that we're generating in the academy. And they want that integrated into policy analysis and planning. They want their voices and their perspective and their ways of knowing included. And they care for the land and for and they want alternatives to fossil fuel. They're really political about. In fact, there's a big conflict in the peoples and the Inuit in the north anyway, because some of them own the land that have just opened for lease for oil leasing, and they want those leases to open. And others of the peoples are very much opposed to this and want a reduction of greenhouse gas. So I think what I wanted to say is that I'm going to stop my share here if I can. Scheherazade, can you stop my share? Can you? Did you stop it? Great. Anyway, I just wanted to end by saying I think I wanted to problematize a little bit this idea of nature as a place where we retreat and we're renewed and all this other kind of stuff. It's much more than that, and it really can provide us an opportunity, I think, as a place to come together and really have, not only, as Kevin was saying, have different kinds of experiences, but experience ourselves and each other very, very differently, and renew ourselves in this, as you were talking about, Kevin, in those social bonds, discovering through the discovery of histories of oppression and violence. That's it.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Sarah. I really appreciate that. I'll admit this, putting together this panel was selfish on my part, because these are questions that I've been thinking about a lot at Point of View and kind of grappling with. And I'm like, okay, how can I get a bunch of folks who know a lot more than me on these issues together so I can learn directly from them and we can have this conversation. So I really appreciate what all of you all have shared, and kind of this maybe reframing, I don't know if that's the right word that you're offering us, Sarah, of being critical about the language that we're using. So I see we have a few questions already, and let's open it up for conversation. So you all can, again, submit questions through the Q&A, but also at this point, if you want to insert your questions or comments into the chat as well, we'll keep an eye on that. Just make sure that you're addressing it to all panelists and attendees so everyone can see. We'd also love to hear directly from you. So if you're open to it, let us know if you have a comment or question, and I can unmute you. You don't have to write it out. We'd love to hear directly from you. So let's start with the questions that have already been submitted. So I'll read it out. And this one came in when you were speaking, Dr. Carmick. So it's perhaps more directly connected to your remarks, but others might very well have some thoughts on this as well. So we have known for decades that exercise and being in nature make us feel better. Is the value of ecotherapy as an official phenomenon simply that you have given it scientific backing? If so, how do you think this is a benefit to those who live at the margins, about whom you expressed concern as not having access to the natural world? Do you imagine that scientific support for this oft experienced and well-known, quote unquote, truth will encourage buy-in?
Thank you so much, and thank you to the other presenters on the panel. I'm learning so much right there with you, Scheherazade, so thank you for putting this great group together. Excellent question as well. I feel like there's a lot to unpack here, so I don't know if this will be as responsive as I would like, but the highlights of my thoughts in that question are these. I'm going to be real for a moment and take off the researcher hat and be your buddy Susie on a Friday afternoon and say, when I first heard that there was a science about going outside, I thought, you've got to be kidding me. Like, this is pretty practical recommendations and this is part of our nature. That said, I wasn't looking at it through the incredible and poignant lenses we looked at it today, structural and environmental racism, social justice, etc. And I don't mean to be rude by not naming all the great perspectives we heard. So that said, there's so much more to unpack here. I'm looking at it more from the social and behavioral sciences, and especially the what motivates people to engage in the healthier behaviors that are good for them when their work demands get in the way of that, is the very specific, problem space I'm in public health. So I spend more of my time not so much explaining and promoting to people this truth that's been around a while, to the point made in the question, but more so helping people to balance, and I don't even like that word, actually negotiate. I use that word very specifically, negotiate the demands of their high pressure, high stakes, high consequence work with their own physicality. Most servant leaders don't want to take time to take care of themselves because they're too busy being of service. And so, so that's the lens I'm bringing forward here, and is a different lens, I think, than the great lenses we've heard. So the perspective I bring into the question is, there's a lot we don't know about ecotherapy that we need to know more about. There's a confounding variable problem, right? If going outside and being active is helpful, was it the going outside? Was it the activity? Or was it the fact you stopped what was causing you stress to go do that? Was it the stopping of the thing that was problematic for your stress? Or was it the doing of the thing, the going outside, the activity, et cetera? So there's more stories to be told within the ecotherapy research. And then that said, as we know more about what is working and what's more efficacious, then we can think about how do we create public health campaigns to raise awareness. Some of what I do, for example, is helping leaders to realize that by, having people, engage in longer conferences or very long full day offsite meetings where they're asked to do strategic thinking, and not encouraging people to take care of their biology, as simple as it sounds, taking breaks, taking bio breaks, as well as movement breaks and mindfulness breaks to get the body to be physically ready for the athletic demands of that engagement. I have to do a lot of advocacy work to help people to see that, and to realize they have a fear of missing out because they're not using their full mental capacity or emotional capacity if they're not taking the time to engage in those endeavors. So I know this isn't perhaps the direct answer to the question, but to me, it's twofold of a problem from a public health perspective. We've got to know more about what it is about ecotherapy that's beneficial to us. We've got to as we get to know that, we need to promote it more to the populations that need to hear it, and not just the niches that I'm focusing on. There are many, many others to share the good news. And actually a third part, which in many ways needs to maybe be bumped up to the first priority, if not, and that is the idea of trying to create equitable access and to address the social inequities. It is not lost on all of us in public health that we have incredible disparities with regards to public health outcomes. And that's not just a healthcare delivery problem, although bias in healthcare is an area that many look at and many are trying to address. We've also got, problems with environment and social interaction that get in the way of these healthier behaviors that, that we're trying to promote. So even though it's a simple pitch to encourage people to be healthier so that they can be happier, it's actually a lot more complex than that. And so ecotherapy is just one piece of that bigger equation. The final thing I'll say, and sorry for letting me, thanks for letting me ramble on about this, is that one of the things that I was so honored to get involved with the ParkRX campaign, which by the way is going on great without me now as I've gone on to other work that I get to do today. But I'm continuing to be a fan of it because what it did was very specifically from a promotion campaign's perspective, we think about the storytelling. Who are you trying to engage with? Who is the person that's delivering that message? What message needs to be shared? What's the call to action that needs to happen? And if we really get strategic about the communication piece, and that's what my PhD is in, is health communication, then it was brilliant in the sense that it was helping open up the eyes and minds of physicians to not just think of lifestyle and specifically time in nature as a prescription opportunity, but then to compel them with scientific messaging to shift into the idea that that could be beneficial for patients locations, and then setting up the health informatics and the delivery needed to be able to execute the campaign, which, and then by the way, that continues to evolve as the group that's in charge of it is trying to raise funding and awareness and stuff. So anything we want to do in public health, addressing the other issues that we're talking about today, and many, many more that are on the table and that need to be on the table that maybe aren't, really drills down into how we can be specific in those advocacy efforts. So I think we can learn a lot from that campaign, and we can also be doing more structural and policy work to be able to create more equity, so that it's not just about choice making on behalf of the population, but also about creating the structures and the norms they need to be supported.
Actually, if I could for a minute, I'd like to just speak to that for a second. I don't know if this concept of nature makes us feel better is an off experience and well-known truth. I mean, I think we need to, I'm not sure that that's necessarily the case. I think there's some of us for whom we recognize and we understand it. I don't know if that's something that the broad population understands, and we can do a much better job of actually helping people to understand that and to see it, and to then start to push for the actions, policies that will increase access to that open space.
Thank you, Kevin. That's an excellent point. Agreed. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Sarah, Emily, did you all have any thoughts on this particular question?
What Kevin said.
Okay.
I think, yeah, I would just second that in terms of ableism in general. I think for a lot of people, going and walking outside or the threat of a hike creates huge amount of palpitations. I myself have a genetic disorder that means that I can't walk very far, but it's an invisible disorder and you can't see it. So having to explain over and over again why I can't be in nature for long periods of time is very detrimental to my mental health and is exhausting. So outside of the fact that I am very privileged to have green space that I can access, I have trouble accessing it. So I think that there is a way that we can bring in questions not just of environmental justice and accessibility, but ability and accessibility. I think there are so many people for whom nature and being away from quote unquote civilization is not necessarily a space of relaxation for them.
Thanks for that, Emily. We have a question for you from Audrey Williams. So Audrey writes, Emily brought some of this in, but I was wondering if the speakers could address at all the gendered implications of how nature is often spoken of as a she, her, and what the implications of that are from a conflict resolution and social justice perspective. Great question. Audrey, I really want to just quickly note that I think you had posted a link in response to a comment. You had posted it to all panelists though, and I think you probably meant to share it with everyone. So if you don't mind pasting that into the chat box for all panelists. But great question about the gendered language around nature. And I guess that's actually for everyone, spurred by Emily's presentation, but addressed to all of the panelists.
I'm actually gonna punt this to Kevin. I know that you don't focus necessarily specifically on gender, but I think that there is a really important gendered aspect to how people relate to nature and how different people relate to create their relationship with nature. So I'm gonna call on you for that one.
Wow. Okay. Hip hop artist Common has a song called Unfaithful. And the song starts out with him asking the question about thinking about this woman that he's dating and He asked the question, what if God was a her? And then he goes through the concept of how would I treat this woman in this relationship if I recognize this godliness in her. I think you can apply the same set of principles. You can apply the same thinking to this notion of nature. I think a lot of people do make a connection, a spiritual connection, almost a religious connection between nature and this higher level of being. And so you can start to ask this question, well, you start to ask the question, would we treat nature differently because we treat women differently? I don't know. It's not clear to me. I'm not sure of that. Do we have this notion of, I imagine that the question is being asked and there's an idea of almost protection, conservation. That's kind of the trend. That's the pathway that you can start to think about when you talk about how you might think about it. How would you think of, but do we need to think about nature differently? Do we need to be thinking about nature as part of I think, Sarah, you were talking a little bit earlier about using the word used and some of the other terms that we use when we talk about the environment. This notion of conservation as if we have to, and protection, as opposed to us as individuals being part of it. We are nature. Why are we talking about ourselves differently? And so I think the answer to that question is all about, to be honest, if you're asking a question about nature being spoken of as a she or her, is how do you view women? I mean, that's the honest question. And if we view women from this notion of I'm gonna get myself in trouble here. But if we view women in a more progressive sense, then does that change how we approach this notion of conservation and protection? Do we need to view nature, this idea of nature, as we are part of it? And I think that starts to help us think differently. And if we view women in a totally different conceptualization, then I think, yeah, it makes us think about all of our relationships with one another. Whether it's relationships with women, with men, with non-binary folks, whomever that might be. So yeah, it's certainly, I don't know if I have a direct answer to the question, but I do think it raises a whole lot of conceptualization, a whole lot of ideas of how we as society view and relate to women, particularly a patriarchal society such as ours. And it raises these questions of what is our connection to nature? Are we part of it? Can we start talking about us as part of nature?
Thank you, Kevin. Sarah, I would love to hear your thoughts on this, because the question also made me think of what you said about nature as a resource to be used. And, Kevin, you're talking about conservation protection, but there's also conquering and ownership.
Yes.
And owning property, right?
Stewardship.
Absolutely. Right.
Yeah,
Sarah,
I would say what you said, which is, I hate to be short, but I don't want to go into a long-winded answer when you really captured, I think, the main point, which is the way we have, in Kevin's point, the way we orient, Audrey's point, the way we orient to nature is, materialized through the language we use to talk about it and how we set ourselves up in relation to it. And I go back to the native people in Utiavik, who've taught me, I've learned or begun to learn from them about a different way of relating to nature, but we're not schooled up in that. We don't know how to do that, I don't think.
Well, and that's
not embedded in the culture we're part of. Yeah.
Thank you. I didn't mean to step on you there. Go ahead, Kevin. I apologize.
I just wonder, Sarah, how do we do that? How do we bring that into these conversations?
Well,
as conflict resolution professionals. Yeah.
I think that you know, I don't know that we can. I think, you know, schools try to start early, right, and get kids out in nature, but, you know, that doesn't work so much, particularly in COVID. And if you're living in an inner city, forget it, right? So I'm not sure the education is a strategy. I do think the park programs that I was talking about with Colette Carmouche and are just fabulous. And she really helps people rethink. They've got programs that help people rethink and understand their relationship with nature entirely differently, right? I also think that if these places became not just our parks, but our outdoors, let's say, our what we understand as nature, became places where we had to think about really hard stuff. Like, I think we should have events at trees where there was lynching. And I think we should gather there. And I think we should talk and cry and you know, confront our histories and everything else. So I think if somehow we integrated, the problem is we've got nature, we go out there and we get away, right? Nature's getting away. We don't want to get away. We want to get pushed back into ourselves and our history, where we have to confront and reflect. So that's what my instinct would be. But I'm kind of, you know, harsh, Kevin. So in other words, I'm all for just, you know, bring it. Let's do it. But I understand that not everybody's ready for that.
Susie, you were going to say something, I think, right?
No, it's such a powerful discussion. So thank you. I'm coming into this space in a different way, in the sense that twofold. I'm thinking about how I think used in my presentation that Mother Earth language, which I admit is something that was, you know, given to me in my you know, privileged experience growing up, and just an assumption, right? But as I've studied some of what I've done that I very briefly mentioned before coming into being a scholar is being a yoga teacher. I continue to train yoga teachers and have been in that space, not just about poses on the mat, but living a yogic life in the sense of being self-compassionate and being compassionate to the world. And so part of this idea of peace that comes with some of the yogic philosophies that are available to us is looking at the duality of masculine and feminine that we each have within ourselves. And so some of the teachings, and I am not well versed, but some of the teachings I've looked at from a Native American perspective refer to Mother Earth and Father Sky. And so this idea of how can Mother and Earth within us, regardless of our gender identity, biologically or in our performance, and also in our interactions with nature, how can we be embracing both, and not in a way that is anything but respectful, which I've heard as a key theme here, and to be embracing the what's possible in the best sense of those within ourselves and with each other.
I just want to bring in something that we're just saying in the chat box, is that the concept of the giving tree, looking back at this idea of gendered language, is that, you know, the tree, just the nature just keeps giving and giving to humanity until humanity destroys it. And that kind of gendered language between the giving tree and the little boy. And that I have always hated that book. But Marion, I don't know you, but hi, spoke out about the Lorax, and I think that is a fantastic model. And I always joke that I'm the Lorax. But I think we should also acknowledge the models of the Lorax in the nonfiction world. The Chipko movement, for whom the phrase tree hugging is created around. We never talk about the concept that tree hugging was invented by Indian women, and that's an incredible important part of the history of an environmental movement that has been completely erased. We don't talk about Wangari Maathai nearly enough, and the idea of her literally putting her life on the line to build peace through building trees. And so I think that it's really important when we talk about how we understand the concepts of nature and environmentalism and peace building to forefront this history, and not not put it on a pedestal, you know, the way that some environmental groups, as Sarah was talking about, have kind of almost infantilized nature, but rather acknowledge that some of the are the very roots of our movements, of our environmental justice movements, of our environmentalist movements, are based in women of color, and that they should be and are the leaders of our movement.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Thanks so much, Emily. We have just a few more minutes and a couple questions. One also from Audrey, and Emily, you actually spoke to this as well, but Audrey is asking, I'm wondering if Suzanne can address the benefits of nature on well-being and the term sitting disease when you're not physically able to stand, stretch, move, etc.
Yes, when we think of the nature of our bodies and our biomechanics, we were built to be moving beings. You know, if we don't let our car move, you know, and we're not a car, but like if you think of a car that's left to sit idly, it will actually stop functioning, you know, at some point. And so that may or may not be too simplistic of a metaphor, but we are built to move. And so one of the, you know, pieces of this problem of diseases, there's chronic diseases in the developed world. There's also diseases of despair that are common to the developed world, which are all related to the lifestyle and what we're doing to get to that development. We've looked at it through many lenses today. So what my work in sitting disease promotion, we were calling it sedentarism in the early 2000s, which didn't ring very many bells. Recently, there was a TED Talk that framed sitting disease as the new smoking. The highlights are that there's over 28 different health conditions that are either created by or made worse by not moving enough. And so if you conceptualize it as another metaphor here, forgive me, an apple or an orange, right? So much of physical activity promotion has centered on getting people moving and exercise formally. But what we're doing more of now, thankfully, and what's really pretty recent, is raising awareness that exercise is only solving one set of issues. We'll call that an orange. And it's actually not necessarily solving another set of issues, which is caused from not moving enough. So many people, for example, will sit a lot throughout the week and then maybe move more on the weekends because that's what's available to them, if that's the kind of lifestyle they're, you know, grateful to have. But then exercise essentially does not solve the moving problem. And so some of the literature has shown us that sitting is definitely not great for us. It's not great for the ways we think and for our health over time. It's a slow moving crisis for the body, essentially. But we also know that standing, there's only recent research on that, and standing more is good, but it's not necessarily that much better. It's the moving that matters is the takeaway from all of what I'm sharing here. So finding times that you can create mini breaks, we have to really almost schedule it, oddly enough, especially living our lives, you know, those of us who are working in this digital space like we're in right now. But our bodies were made to move frequently. If you think of a puppy or a cat, they move all the time and they stretch and move, and we're made to do that. So part of the public health awareness work I'm doing is not just raising the awareness that it is really unhealthy and medically ill-advised, that we need to move more, you know, that we're not moving enough, but to really kind of sell, frankly, the idea that we actually are more productive, more creative, have better performance, have better mental health outcomes, can decrease depression, among other outcomes, if we move more. Now, that said, I know part of the question was looking at, well, what about people who are chair bound? What about people who are, whether it's physically or socially or both? And I don't mean to be anything but respectful. Functional movement, for those those who are not fully able-bodied. I don't like using the word disabled. Those who have functional challenges with movement, who may or may not be bound to a chair, moving for them does help as well. And whether they are doing the moving themselves or needing assistance, that is helpful for a variety of our physiologic issues, physiologic systems, to prevent, some of the issues that I'm talking about. So please move more. Please let's stop, thinking that we have to sit still to pay attention as we were taught in school. And let's actually start to rethink how much we can bring moving and, yes, even dancing into the day. And my second book, Genius Breaks, gives people tips on how they can do that. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Susie. I hope it might be okay with our panelists if we can take just a couple minutes more and address Mary Kate Wolfell's last final question, which I think is a really good one. She's asking, thinking about how Americans usually access food and that the source of food is obscured from us, how does this impact our relationship to nature? Related to Sarah's presentation, I'm thinking also of indigenous hierarchies of giving the most importance to natural entities that sustain the most life: water, air, plants, animals, and least importance to entities that fewer other entities depends on humans, such as humans. And then she clarifies hierarchy is not the right word, more like cosmology, system, or way of understanding our place in the world. Anyone have any final thoughts on that? Great question.
I mean, I'll speak to it very quickly. I mean, I think I'm a big foodie. I love to cook and eat food and kind of enjoy that whole culinary experience. Only in the last year have I really started, and I love seafood, and so I love shrimp. In the last year, I've started actually eating the shrimp with the heads on. People might think that, or at least purchasing the shrimp with the heads on. And people might think that's kind of a silly comment here to raise. But most people think shrimp is this little curly-Q thing with this little piece of tail shell on the end. And they don't recognize that this is actually an animal, that gives itself up in the sea and is part of our culinary experience. So I think most of the time we go and we get beef, and it comes to us and it's all nicely ground, and we get that. So particularly for those of us who have a carnivorous diet and we're meat eaters, we don't have this full connection with society, with nature. We think it's something, we think nature's food is something that we get, we bring it home, we're done. We're not connected to the fact that it actually comes from a living, breathing thing. Same thing with nature. We're not as connected. It's something that we go to and then we come back. And so we need to rethink how we are part of nature. And I think our food, rethinking our food system, localized food systems where we're actually, maybe we're even able to go to the farms where our foods come from, and see the food, the animals, the plants that actually produce, the fields that produce that food, would be amazing to see.
I just wanted to compliment the question. I thought it was a fabulous question. And Kevin, I really appreciated your response to it. And I think that's really one of the big takeaways of our session today is seeing whether or not, whether or not we are integrated, the way in which we're integrated with nature versus using it and taking advantage of it, et cetera. So yeah. I thank everybody today. I really enjoyed it. Appreciated the questions.
I will say, one of my favorite things in the Smithsonian Zoo here in Washington, D.C. is that there is a new "Where did your food come from?" section. And it's got a little farm where they have the entire area is what it takes to make a pizza. And it's, so they have a little farm section of wheat, and they have like a petting zoo with goats for milk, and they grow tomatoes, and and I don't think they go into pepperoni, but it's it's an entire section, because what they found was that kids didn't know where their pizza came from.
Right.
And I love that simplistic connection, and I think it's a great place to start the conversation. And one of the things that in my work is I feel very strongly about in terms of environmental and climate justice is helping communities stay in touch with their cultural food, because food is such an important part of your community that, whether it's okra or cornbread or black-eyed peas, obviously I'm from the South and I'm hungry, but whatever it is, that is an essential part of you, and you should be able to grow it and see how it grows and understand it. And if you want to, and that access should exist. So I love this idea of how to make a pizza. I love the idea of how to grow okra. And I think that going forward, especially in urban areas, it's only going to become more important to reconnect our kids and our students with the land.
Yeah.
Thanks for that, Emily. And speaking of pizza, I know at least a couple of our panelists were planning pizza nights. That's a great way for us to end the session. But thank you all so much. Thank you to the panelists. I mean, I thought this was a fascinating conversation. So many diverse and critical questions that were raised, and I'm going to continue to think about. And also thank you to everyone who attended, and the questions and the comments in the chat box. Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Have a good evening.
Thank you for putting this together, Shahrazad. It was beautiful.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Lovely.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes.
Have a good
Thank you very
weekend.
much.
Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye-bye now.
Care.